Good morning all, myself Chandra, and in our today's session we will discuss about RAML. So basically RAML is a RESTful API modeling language, and in order to go through these sessions we need to know few abbreviations for the understanding of the session. So it is like what is REST? REST means representational state transfer, and API is the application programming interface. So whenever we say API, it is a piece of code that we wanted to expose our services or functionality through an application. So we are going to develop a program that can provide specific requirements or functionalities, and we are going to expose those functionality in the form of interfaces, in the form of simple methods and signatures. So that we will call as API. And we also have understood what is URL while developing the services from Anyplan Studio and how we were testing it from the Postman. So URL is our entire URL like uniform resource locator, and it will be like the protocol and the host name and also port number along with the resource names. And URI is part of the URL, so resource indicator. So there will be URI parameters if it is a dynamic value, and it will be part of the URL. And HTTP means hypertext transfer protocol. It is one of the protocols that can be used to communicate between the systems. And HTML. So HTML is hypertext markup language. It will be mainly used in front-end applications development and to display the content on the web browsers. And XML is like extensible markup language, and it is in the form of tags and enclosed by using the starting tag and ending tags, and we need to represent the data or other child nodes within that parent tags or root tags. And JSON, so JSON means it is one of the object notational format like a JavaScript object notation. We can use it for representation of the data. So basically REST API means it is a programming interface or a web API where we are going to expose the resources of the functionalities that we have developed in the form of services by using resources, and we are going to expose our information of records from the producer or provider applications, and we are going to expose these services to the consumers. So whoever is going to need the information from the provider services, they need to send a request to the providers. So in between that, we are building a REST API. It is going to act as a communication medium to send the request from the consumer applications to provider application, and also it will get a response from provider application, and it will transport or transform the data from provider applications to consumer application. So provider application means whoever is going to provide the response, and consumer application means whoever is submitting the request and who wants to receive a response for that particular request. Those we call it as consumer or consumer applications. So REST API is an architecture style, and in order to develop the REST API programs, we need to follow a certain rules, and below are the rules that we need to follow, and based on these rules we are going to build our services to follow the REST API architectural style. For example, uniform interface. So whenever we say uniform interface means we wanted to expose our services from the provider applications. For example, there is a supplier's record within the system, and we wanted to expose the suppliers or provide that response to some other application. So in this, instead of giving the complexity like what is to be done and how it has to be done, So we are going to specify or hide that complexity of the system architecture, and also without worrying what is going to happen in the provider application, we are going to make sure that we will provide a simple resource or identification of resources to the service whoever is going to consume these interfaces or REST APIs. In this way, we are following a uniform interface, and there we are going to mention that they just have to mention what kind of data they need to receive and what is the request they wanted to send. And also in this uniform interface, we also making sure that it is easy to understand the request and also the response messages by developing the uniform interface. And another feature is stateless. So whenever requests are received from the consumer applications, so we need to separate the request with all the information, necessary information. For example, if we wanted suppliers information, so the request has to send all the information what is to be done with that particular request and where we have to send it, and also what is to be done from the received data. So do we need to apply any filters? So all this information we should receive from single request, so that we can make sure that all the requests are not dependent. And so for example, we are sending a request, and instead of making the request waiting for the response and also process it later, so we are going to make sure that one request contains all the information, and also subsequent requests are not dependent. In this way, we can provide that information in stateless manner. So here we also going to follow a client server architectural style, because in the design patterns, client and server needs to be communicated, and they needs to be separated, because there should not be any application to application dependencies or system to system integrations dependencies. Today we have 2 or 3 systems in our organization, and we might need to use another system or application to hold another kind of information. For that purpose, we are an organization that we are going to evolve independently instead of depending on other applications within the existing organizational architecture. So we are making sure that it is not dependent and we can evolve easily whenever there is a need. And also when we are exposing the services, we are going to make sure that the communication is not broken whenever we are evolving the systems or applications, so that if there is a new information or new kind of data that we wanted to store within the existing application also, or in the new application or new data centers, so this and that information we are consuming from that resources is not dependent, and if there is a new information, then we are going to add that new information into a new resources, and so that we can provide the services to other consumers or applications, so that they are not broken and they can still use the existing services, as well as they can enhance the services with the new resources that we are providing. And we are also following the layered system, instead of so we are also following the layered system to build the REST API services. Like instead of providing all the applications interfaces in one API, we are going to separate all the applications by providing an API interface, and also we are going to provide multiple interfaces, and we are going to follow the cacheable and code on demand. So whenever there is a need that we wanted to store that information, if it is not a frequent updated changes, then we can store the data within the APIs and we can give a response quickly instead of going and sending a request each time to the provider system. And code on demand. So code on demand is like that code on the provider system needs to be executed whenever there is a request that has been sent to that particular functionality or particular provider system. So it is like it will be executed only when there is a request for that particular resource. And we are going to discuss about resource, what is the method and metadata, payload, response codes, and we are going to define the services and REST APIs using this. So resource means the main abstract of information in REST is a resource. So instead of knowing all the complexity, we just need to know what is the resource. Like if we want to get the information for supplies, we just need to add that resource at the end of the URL. So like it is a suppliers resource. So we can get that suppliers information. And any information that we wanted to expose can be a resource name. For example, employees information. So it will be an employees resource. And if we want orders information, so we are going to expose it as a orders resource. Like that, it will be mostly nouns that we are going to represent as a resources. And the state of the resource at any point of time is called as a resource representation. I mean to say at any point means our particular point of time. So we are sending a request at 10:1 and whatever the information that was available on the provided system, we need to get that information. So it is going to provide a response and that we are going to call it as a resource representation because there might be a change at 10:2 and whenever we are going to send a new request at 10:3, then we should get the latest data from the provider. So the information of the resource is modified at the provider system and we need to get that updated or latest data. So at 10.3, the resource representation is going to provide an updated data whenever we are going to send a request. And it is going to contain all the information like what is the data that we will get, or we can call it as body as well. And what kind of metadata, if it is having any headers information, and also if we need to send any of the metadata means it is like a data of data, query parameters or headers and also URI parameters that we will call it as metadata. So hypermedia links are like if there is any additional methods are implemented on the particular resource, we can return that information within the payload body and as a hypermedia link so that they can send or reuse the information that was represented in the form of response body. And another one, hypermedia or MIME type. So here hypermedia or MIME type means what is the response type of what is the response format or request format that needs to be sent for the API resource or for that particular service. So that we will call it as a hypermedia or MIME type. And we are going to follow and we are going to define our APIs by using the resource methods or verbs. Resource methods are like get. Get means we are going to fetch the information or retrieve the information, and post means we are going to send a request that needs to be created on the target system. Put. Put and patch are like to update the information, and there will be one difference. Put is like a full resource replacement or a updation, and if that resource is not available, then we can create that resource as well if we are using a put operation. And patch means it is a partial update, so whatever the data that we are sending, we need to update that particular information only. Delete, so delete is like we need to remove that particular resource from the provider application on the target system. And there are other resource method servers like options and head, but we do not use it regularly. Now we are going to create an API specification. So we have seen that what is API and what is REST API. In RAML, it is like a RESTful API modeling language. That means before we implement our services, we wanted to create an API specification. Like it is a schema. In order to create a schema or design our schema, we are going to follow the RESTful API modeling language and we will design our APIs so that we can create the resources and what are the resources that are available for that particular services or API. And also we are going to provide the information like what kind of request payload that it will accept and what are the metadata parameters that we can send, and also what are the verbs or methods that are available for that particular resource. All of this information we are going to define within the API specification by using RAML in Anypoint Design Center. And we have some samples like this will be our supplier's information that we wanted to return, and this is the supplier information we wanted to create. So we have information from the requirement, but instead of directly implementing the services by using Anypoint Studio, we need to design our specification. So it is always a design first approach. So Mulesoft services are always like a design first approach. So we are going to design our APIs before implementing the uh, actual services. Now we are going to Anypoint Studio, and here we see that we have suppliers API flow and create suppliers, post suppliers. And as of now, we have HTTP listeners on the particular flows, and we are sending an information. But for this, we can send any kind of data, like we can send the JSON data and we can even send the XML data. It is not going to verify at the starting point before accepting the request. It will send the request, and in between there might be a failure if it is not able to process that request or interpret that particular request. And instead of sending the request to that particular flow, we wanted to restrict that by using an API specification so that what kind of data it will accept. For that information, we are going to use a API specification. Since it is a get suppliers information, we are not going to provide any input request for this, but we are going to provide a response. What kind of response this service will provide. And for suppliers, post suppliers request, we are going to mention what kind of data that it has to accept. And once if it is a acceptable data, then only trigger this flow and it is going to perform the operation. And for that purpose, we are going to Anypoint platform, and from there we will design our API. So in Anypoint platform, go to Design Center, and from here there is an option Create New. Click on Create New. Here select a new API specification. Provide the project name. HBT suppliers API. And we need to provide what is a specification language. We have RAML 1.0 and RAML 0.8, and there are other methods like OAS. OAS means Open API Specification. It was also called as Swagger. And I'm going to provide the specification language as RAML 1.0. Create API. So here we will discuss. On the left pane, we have the files to be created if we need any additional files. And here we have dependencies. So here we can add the fragments and dependencies into this API. And if we want to publish this setter API, we are going to publish from the exchange. So from this exchange option, we can publish, or we can choose the publish option on the right top side. So we have a HPT suppliers API RAML, and this will be our main RAML. And we are going to provide the information like what is the RAML version and also a title. If we want to add any description for this API, we can provide. Now, since we wanted to provide services like to get the information from the provider or target system. So for that, we are going to provide a resource. So to add a resource or to create a resource, we need to use slash and then resource name. Since our operation is for suppliers, we need to provide suppliers as a resource name and then add a colon. And after that, enter. So there is a tab space between the line number 5 and 6. So this we will call it as indentation. And here we need to specify what are the methods that are applicable for this supplier's resource. Here, whenever I say methods means it is a verbs or HTTP methods. So we need to get the supplier's information. Okay. And for this method, we need to provide additional details like under get method, we wanted to provide information like you can add description and also display name, all kind of information. So to add this information, there is one shelf. So on the lower side, we have a shelf. And here we have option to select the different types of tags. For example, select description, returns list of suppliers detail. Now we are also going to provide information like what kind of responses this get suppliers resource will provide. Since it is a get method, we don't need to specify the body for this. So I'm going to add responses, and under the responses section, we need to mention what kind of response codes it will provide. I'm mentioning 200. 200 means it is a success response. Under 200, we need to specify the information for the responses, like what will be the response format that supplies information will provide. Click on body, and we need to mention what is the format, like application JSON or XML. So for now, I am selecting application JSON, and here we need to provide the information. For example, I'm going to add an example. Whenever we add an example, we can add the values. So for that, I'm going to Notepad and I'm copying these details. Use a tab space so that it will move to the right side, to the correct position. Here we are defining a get suppliers resource, and we are saying that it is going to represent an success response with 200, and it is going to provide a response in the mentioned format. And I am going to check for this particular how it will be added. Whenever we are adding these details or resources and methods, then it is going to add that on the right side documentation. It is also going to provide an automatic documentation for the APIs. So this is our description for the API, and the endpoints are suppliers get method. So click on it, and here we can verify that description of this particular get method for suppliers. And we have a code examples like in curl means in Postman you can use this, or there are other consumers who can access the request by using curl command. And if you want to choose any other coding, then you can copy this simple script and you can implement it. And here we have the responses. So responses is a body as of now, and it is going to provide a application media type as a JSON format. And this is our example. It is providing the list of suppliers information. And we can also perform a mock test. So this is going to be a mock test, since as of now we have defined the resources only, but we are not connected to any of the database or any of the target system. So it will be a mock operation. So dummy data will be sent or dummy data will be retrieved. So to get the dummy data, we need to define the examples. Here click on the try it, and whenever we are going to perform the try operation, then it is going to provide a request URL. Like you can see that there is a any point mocking URL, and also at the end there is a supplier's resource. Here click on send. If we want to add any query parameters, headers, then we can add it here. Check the response. So our response is returning 200, okay, and this is our response. In this way, we can perform a mocking or dummy request, and we can test the services at the design time or design phase itself, so that we are making sure that our resources are defined as per the API design document. So as of now, we have provided an example with two suppliers information returning an array of suppliers. And instead of directly providing an example, we need to define what are the mandatory parameters or fields that it needs to return, and it needs to be aligned with a data type. For that information, we can add the data type for this get suppliers resource for the JSON format. So under application JSON, use enter, and then here we are going to add the details. Since our example is returning array of information, we need to add schemas as items, and these items array of information is containing the objects information, so we need to use properties. Under properties, we need to provide these field names. So add a field name, and we need to provide what kind of data it will represent for this particular field. So I'm going to mention string. And also we have another parameters or field values, supplier name. And for this supplier name, we can make sure that mention the type as string, and also I'm going to provide the required as true. So whenever we are adding the supplier number string, that means it is a type string and it is also required. So in RAML language, if we are not providing this particular property, that means it is an required parameter or required property. And we are also going to define one more property for isActive. Use isActive, and then here I'm going to mention type string, and this is a required false. That means isActive field is not mandatory in the objects that we are going to receive as a response. And I am going to add one more parameter, address. Type string and then required false. So to add a direct data type, we don't need to specify the properties under the supplier name property. So I mean to say additional properties. For example, for supplier name, we are adding two properties for the supplier name. That is the reason we are adding this information under the supplier name. If it is a direct property, like it is a required field and also data type is string or date, then we can directly mention in one line. And we are also going to check how we can represent the required false parameter. That means whenever we say required false, that means it is an optional field. So if we check here, so I'm going to make a change. Instead of defining this required in the properties, additional properties of address field, I am removing this and I am going to add a question tag at the end of this particular property. That means it will become a optional parameter or optional property. In this way, we can define the property. We are also going to define one more property, state, and this state field is a mandatory. So I'm just defining type is a string and leaving it blank. That means it is a that means it is a mandatory property or mandatory field. So as of now, we have defined this mandatory, right? So let us try to remove the state property value from the first object. So whenever we are removing this, it is throwing an error. So to check the errors, we can go to the lower right corner and click on this project errors. And here you can see that should have required property state and it is mentioning of 0. That means it is, since it is an array, it is representing the first record of that particular response. So whenever there are errors, then it will throw an error in the API design itself. Now I am going to remove the is active. So is active and address are optional. So I am going to remove is active from the first object and let us verify. There are no project errors. And from the second object, I am going to remove the address. So address is optional. In this way, we can represent our schema or data type for that particular resource and method. We can check for the new or updated service details. Now go to the documentation, click on back to docs or click on the documentation here. So here you can see, click on summary and I am going to retest the suppliers, get supplier and try it, send a request. Now we can see that it is returning a new response that we have provided as an example. In this way, we can provide the data type and also the example. Now we will create one more method for the suppliers. So as of now, we are just retrieving the information of the suppliers. Now we want to create a new supplier. For that, you can, so to collapse these details, click on this and then I'm going to the same level where we have a get method, we need to add another method if we want a supplier resource to be exposed as another method. So we are going to create suppliers information. For that, add post as a method. Under post, since we want to create a information on the target system, we need to send a request with a payload body. For that, we need to mention body. And under body, we need to define what kind of data it will represent. It is going to be an application JSON format data. And application JSON description. Description will create new supplier in target system. This is our description, and then I am going to add a data type and also example. So to add the data type, we need to make sure what kind of data we are going to provide. If it is an array of records, then we have to choose items. If it is the object, we need to choose properties. So choose properties, and I am going to use the existing example here. Our example is going to have supplier name is active, address and state information. So copy this and we will change it here. It is going to have a property or field name like supplier name, and we need to mention the type of data it will accept like string data. It will be in the same way that we have defined our get responses body, and another field is active, and this is a optional. For that we need to define two parameters. So click enter and add a tab. Here we are going to provide type, it is a string, and then required, it is optional, so we have to mention false, and another value address. So to add address, since it is at the same level of is active or supply name, we need to make sure it is also at the same level. Address type string, and it is also optional parameter, but instead of declaring it as a required false property, we are going to add a question tag in the property, and another value state. So state is also string. I'm going to remove this example. So we are defining a post body that is going to accept the supplier name, is active, address, state values, and it is going to return an information with a success message. So to define our success message, we have to add a responses body as well. So under the same level of body, we need to add responses. So this responses is going to provide an information 201. So whenever we are creating a resource, that means it needs to return a 201 that resource is created successfully. So here I am going to add a response body. Response body, it will be application JSON, and application JSON is going to have a properties. It is going to provide a information with a message, and that message will be having a string information. So I am providing message string, and it is a mandatory. So in this way we are going to represent the information. As of now we have just added the schema or data type for this request body and also response body, but we have not provided any examples. So I'm going to the main documentation summary, and here whenever we have added another method post method under the same resource suppliers, we can see that information is reflecting on the documentation and mock URLs. So I'm going to click on the post, and within the post we can see there is information within the examples what kind of values we need to send or what kind of request we have to submit for this particular service, and we can also see what are the required parameters and what are the optional parameters. Whenever there is no required, that means it is an optional field. Click on try it, and here you can provide the values. Since it is a dummy service or dummy URL, we can send a request, and we can see that there is a 201 response code success. Now I am going to remove the supplier name from the input request and sending a new request. So whenever we are sending a new request without the mandatory fields, then we are receiving a bad request. That means it is saying a invalid schema or content type, and also providing an information what are the required fields missing in the particular request. So in this way we can make sure that we are going to validate the request before it is sending to the actual implementation or the flow. So as of now we have seen that post, body, and also responses, and we are going to provide an example here. Add example, And this example is going to contain the information like this. Okay, we have example for the request body. Now we are going to add example for the response body. I am going to add a response here, example, and our message is like message supplier created successfully. So we are providing a message, response message with key message and also string value supplier created successful. Let us retest this. I am going to post, and then here we can see that it is also providing a response code as well as the examples now. Earlier we were not able to see this example, and here we can see that it is having a new information without the blank or empty string values. Click on create. Now click on try it and send a request. So we can see that response is coming with a message. So in this way, we can make sure that what is the input that we can send and what will be the response format that we will give. So that the consumer applications will come to know what kind of data they have to send before invoking or consuming the particular service, and what will be the response format that they are going to receive from that particular service. Accordingly, they can interpret within their application and they can process the data. Now we have defined get post. Suppose there are list of suppliers like supplier 1 and supplier 2, but there is a need we wanted to update particular employee information. So to update particular employee information, we need the supplier number. So to get that supplier number and send that as a parameter. So to send that as a parameter, we can send it in the query parameters or headers, or we can use it in the URI parameters. And always the standard and the best practices is to use it as a URI parameter for the unique identification and perform the operation on that particular record only. So for that, we are going to use another method. So here I am going to define two more resource methods. Patch for updating the partial information of the particular employee, and this patch is needs to be applied on the particular supplier information. For that we are going to use a URI parameter. So to define a resource as a URI parameter, we need to use slash and then curly braces or flag braces. Here mention supplier number, add colon, and then enter. So instead of directly defining this patch at the get or post level, we need to use it under the supplier number. Otherwise, this patch will be applied to all the suppliers information. Here add a patch method, and then this patch method also needs to be provided with a body. Provide application JSON and then properties. I am going to provide these properties as supplier name and status. I want to update only supplier name and status information from this particular service. So I have supplier name and then is active. So I have to mention what are the required parameters. So required, and it is false, and also type is string. And for supplier name also I am going to provide same details. So it can have any of these values. So we are going to perform a check in the actual implementation. If both fields are empty, then we are not going to make a request to the target system. If any of this information is available, then only we will make a request to that particular service and add responses for this method responses, and it is going to return 200. Body will be application JSON, and it is going to contain a properties for the message string and example. So our example is message supplier updated successfully. So this is just an success message response. If we want to add any other types of messages, whenever the request is failed, what kind of information you will get. So to add those kind of responses, you can use another response codes here. So you can mention that, for example, there is a 500 or 400 or 401. So you are going to make sure that what kind of response you are going to throw from the actual service. That information we need to provide here. For example, there is a 401 error. So 401 is actually a authentication issue. So we want to mention message unauthorized user. So you are going to provide an information whenever there is a 401 error in the particular service, you are going to message or reply in the form of message and unauthorized user. And you can always define this within the actual implementation, how you are going to throw that information. I am removing this as of now. All I mean to say is that we can add as many response codes as possible, and we can define the application types and also the what kind of examples and data types that it can provide. So this is a patch supplier. I am also going to add another method for this particular resource or URI parameter. Under supplier number, I am going to add delete method. So add delete method, and for the delete method we don't want to send any of the request payload, so we don't have to mention body, and we are going to provide the responses. So responses will be 200 and body application JSON properties. So properties is message string, and we are going to add example message, and message is like supplier deleted successfully. We can even add in the form of JSON also, since it is a JSON response and it is a object. We can also add in this way. Save the changes, and you can see that there is a star mark. That means there are unsaved changes. And once the changes are saved, and you can always verify if there are any errors in that particular design or API specification. Now we will verify the services. Go to documentation summary, and within the documentation summary, now we can see that there are two methods for the suppliers resource, and also two methods under the suppliers slash supplier number. That means our main resource will be suppliers, and sub resource or a URI parameter is a supplier number, since it is having a flower braces. And also we are going to provide the methods for patch and delete. So I'm going to check for patch method, and here you can see the sample example, and this is our sample response. Okay, since we have not added the example within this patch, it is showing the values from the data type. So to add an example, we can use example and use the supplier name and supplier number. So this is our example, and it is able to reflect on the documentation also. And let me verify. Yeah, okay. And we can see that supplier name and is active, both are optional, and click on try it. And whenever we are going to send or invoke this particular service, patch service of the suppliers, and it is asking for a URI parameter. So after the suppliers, for this resource there is a supplier number, and it is a mandatory. It is a URI parameter and it is a mandatory field. So since it is part of the URL, and we are calling it as a URI parameter, and it will be changed dynamically for each and every request. We don't need to mention we don't have to mention the same supplier number all the times. So it is always dependent on the consumer application, for which supplier we want to update the information, or for which supplier we wanted to remove the information. So those kind of details is going to be changed. That means it is a dynamic, and that is the reason we are providing this as a URI parameter. Provide as supplier 1 and send a request. So we are sending supplier 1 and we are receiving a response as success. Even though we do send a different request here, I am providing a supplier 2 and send a request. Whether you are sending a information with supplier 1 or 2, it is not going to validate the actual record, and it is just providing a mock response from the service. In this way, you can check for the delete operation as well. So as of now, we have defined 4 resources. One, 2 for suppliers get and post, and another 2 for supplier number to perform update of the supplier and also delete the supplier information. Now, instead of getting all the information from the suppliers, we wanted to define additional filter conditions. So to provide that information, we can define them by using the parameters like headers or query parameters. So right now I am going to add a query parameters. So to add the query parameters, you can come under the get resource method and add a query parameter stack. Here we have to define what is the query parameter name. So I'm going to define, I wanted to provide a parameter name as status, and this parameter name is a optional one, and also it is going to accept the information of data type string and required is false. So if we do not provide this required false, then we must always send a query parameter with status, otherwise it will throw an error. I will check for that. I'm going to remove this required false, and I'm going to verify the suppliers get resource. Click on try it, and if we observe here, there is a required field status, and if we are going to send a request without status field, it will throw an error. Yeah, since it is enabled, that means it is sending a value with empty or blank string, and I have disabled this so that the particular field itself will be not sent, and we can observe that it is throwing an error like required parameter status is missing. In this way, we can make the parameters, whether it is an optional parameter or a required parameter. So we are designing our API in more better way and more understandable way, like what will be the information that you can send. And I'm going to provide another parameter like address. So address type string, and also this parameter is optional, so required false. I'm just going to show you the difference. So we have status, I'm disabling it, and address also disabling it. I'm sending a request, and we can observe that it is only throwing an error for the status. It is not throwing an error for address because it is an optional parameter. And in the same way, we can define additional metadata for this request by using headers. So there is another keyword, headers, and in headers, while sending the request, we want to add additional information. For example, we want to provide the client ID or client secret to validate the data or to validate the consumer application, whether he is a valid consumer or not. So to provide that information, we are going to provide details like client username or a client ID. So I am providing client ID, and this is a string information. Type is string, and also required true. Because we always need to get this information, we are making sure it is a required parameter, and also client secret required true. And from the consumer application, we might receive additional information, but it is not mandatory. Like we wanted to have information like source channel. So what is the source channel or source system? But it is not mandatory. So we can mention source system, and source system is a type string, but it is optional. Required is false. In this way, we can make sure that what are the optional fields and what are the mandatory fields. And we are going to verify that service here. Click on try it. And here we can see headers information also and what are the mandatory fields. And here we have option to check for the or to show for the optional fields. So click on this, you can get the source system, which is an optional parameter. This is how we can add the metadata information into the particular service. So as of now, we have designed our API specification even though we are not implementing the actual service and without uh, creating a connection to the target system. We have just defined our or designed our API specification. What are the resources that can be provided from this suppliers interface or suppliers API, and what are the requests that you can send, and what is the response that you will get from the suppliers interface or suppliers API. And we will see how we can extract these information instead of providing at all the places. For example, these query parameters or headers information is needed for all the resources or all the methods. Then instead of defining at each level or each method, we can define at the API level, and we can make sure that it is provided and applied to all the methods. In this way, we can reuse the code and we can apply it one place, and we can reduce the code as well. So we are going to organize the code in well manner, and also we are going to reuse the methods, or also we can reuse the data types, and we can define as a separate folders and structures that we will see in our next session. Thank you.